In today's homily, I'm going to be focused on the idea of naming. And so I've picked out a reading that looks at given names in Scripture and nicknames that Jesus gave to his disciples. So it's a section from Isaiah, Matthew, and Mark. From Isaiah. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And two passages from Matthew. This was a message given to Joseph about Mary. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, and he would be called a Nazarene. And from Mark, these are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter; James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder; Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who was to betray him. Words inspired by God. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus the homily today on the idea of naming. And in fact, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to look at this. Today, the focus will be on naming human beings. And then next Sunday, with God's help, naming God and spiritual ideas. And then on the third Sunday, as is my wont, I'll do a recap of the first two homilies and then open it up to question, answer, discussion, etc. So my own mother, whom we call Peg, her given name was Margaret, was born on the 11th of January in the year 1927. If she had lived, she'd be 94 next week. And she was born at home, which was very much the way things were done in Ireland in the 1920s. And the day after she was born, my grandmother, whom I knew as Nana, sent my grandfather, Daddy Jim, to the local courthouse in Galway to register the birth. Since the child was born at home, it had to be registered elsewhere. And so my grandfather goes out early in the morning, really, really happy. His firstborn child has been born. And he's going and he meets a few of his buddies. And his buddies hear the good news and they drag him kicking and screaming into a local pub. And they ply him with liquor. And 3 or 4 hours later, he staggers out of the pub and he's making his way to the courthouse. And by the time he got to the courthouse, he couldn't remember what the name of the child was. My grandmother said the child is going to be called Margaret. Go register her as Margaret. He gets to the courthouse, and for the life of him, he can't remember what her name was. So he gives it his best guess, and he comes up with a name, and he registers it. And he comes home, and my grandmother says to him, "Did you register the child?" He said, "I did." She presumed he got it right. Almost 20 years later, when my mother herself was about to get married, and she needed a birth certificate, and she goes to the courthouse, and she picks up her birth certificate, and she can't recognize whose name is on it. It's a totally different name. And so I want to talk about naming today, the importance of naming. And I'm going to make just 3 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about naming rituals. And then secondly, about initiation rites. And then thirdly, the idea of name as mission. So firstly, naming rituals. And I'm just going to focus on 3 different cultures because kids are named very, very differently from culture to culture. I'm going to have a quick look at how we name children in the Irish culture, a very, very quick look at naming in the Jewish culture, and then thirdly, naming in the Kalenjin culture. So firstly, with the Irish culture, how did we name kids traditionally in the Irish culture? And there was a very strict protocol. The first boy would always be called after the paternal grandfather. And the first girl would be called after the paternal grandmother. The second boy would be called after the maternal grandfather. The second girl would be called after the maternal grandmother. The third boy would be called after the father, and the third girl would be called after the mother. And then if there were other kids after that, you were free to choose any name you wanted. So is it any wonder that Irish Catholics had big, big families? In order to exercise any kind of creativity with naming a kid, you had to have 6 kids to start with, and then you had a clean slate. And so I look at my own family. I'm the firstborn of my parents. And so I should have been named after my paternal grandfather. But for some reason or other, they named me after both my paternal grandfather and my paternal grandmother. So my paternal grandfather was named John, and my paternal grandmother was called Frances. And they baptized me as John Francis. When the second boy came along, Seamus, he was named after my maternal grandfather, whose name was James, Daddy Jim. I used to call him Daddy Jim. And Seamus is simply the Gaelic form of the name James. So he was called Seamus. When the first girl came along, she should have been called after my paternal grandmother. She should have been called Frances, but she wasn't. For some reason, my parents decided to break with tradition at this stage, and they named her Deirdre. In fact, her full name was Deirdre Mary Dolores. Now, it's an interesting makeup of name. So there's a famous character in Irish mythology going back about 2,500 years called Deirdre of the Sorrows. She's one of the great heroines in Irish folklore. And there's also one of the titles of Mary, the mother of Jesus, was Mary of the Sorrows, Mary Dolores. And so they called her Deirdre Mary Dolores. And as I was thinking about this homily just yesterday, I was thinking, is there perhaps another reason why they called her Dolores? Because she was born on the 3rd of September, 1949, exactly 10 years to the date of the outbreak of World War II. So somewhere in their minds were they thinking, it's a child, it's her first girl, but it's a time of sorrow. War has broken out. But for whatever reason, she's given this great ancient Celtic name, and then added on to that is Mary Dolores. When my second sister was born, they half broke with tradition. They called her Ethna Jane. Now, Jane was the name of my maternal grandmother, so that would be okay. That should have been her name. But her given name was really Ethna. And Ethna is another great heroine in ancient Irish folklore. So now we got 2 girls named for great heroines in Irish folklore. When the next boy was born, they called him after my father, which was, again, that was the tradition. He was the third boy, so he should be called after my father. My father was Patrick, or Paddy, and so they named him, this child, Pádraig, and Pádraig is simply a Gaelic form of the name Patrick. So they're keeping the tradition with the boys. When the final girl was born, they called her Dervla, and Dervla is a third great Irish heroine. And so I look at my own family, all the girls are given these really powerful ancient Celtic names, and so it's no wonder they turned out to be really powerful women. And all the boys are given the kind of traditional names. So that's how it happened in Irish families traditionally. When you look at naming within the Jewish tradition, a child cannot be named after a living relative. You can't name a child after a living relative within Judaism. You have to call it after a dead relative. But they kind of got around a little bit by, they would give a child very often a Jewish name and a Western name together. And so my good friend, Arlen, her real name, her full name is Arlen Chava. And Chava is called for a dead relative of hers. And so within the Jewish tradition, they would begin to mix these two Western and Jewish names, but always for a dead Jewish relative. The Kalenjin have this great system of naming kids. And basically, there are 3 different kinds of names that are given to the Kalenjin peoples when a baby is born in the Kalenjin system. And so first name has to do with the circumstances of the birth. And so if you ask any child in Kenya, what is your name? And the child tells you her name, you can tell a whole lot about the circumstances of the child's birth. So if a little girl tells me, my name is Cherop, I know that the child was born when it was raining. If she says to me, I know she was born at dawn. If she says, I know she was born during a famine time. So the first name it gives you a lot of information about the circumstances of the child's birth. The second name was several days after the child was born, they would bring an elder of the tribe in who knows the ancestry of this little baby. And the elder would begin naming off the names of the ancestors chronologically. And when the child sneezed, they would believe that that is the spirit that had reincarnated as this child. So that was the second name that was given to the child. So sneezing was really interesting in East Africa. I lived in Tanzania for a while when I was learning Swahili. And there's a great proverb in Tanzania. It's like when a child sneezes in Tanzania, the mother will say to the child, "Kulia juu, chini ni moto." Grow upwards, down is too hot. And so sneezing is really important. There's a great significance for East African peoples. So that was the second name that was given in the Kalenjin tradition. Then there was a third name given, and it was a special name that was used only by the mother to the child, and it was called Gainetab Muserek, literally the porridge name. And Gainetab Muserek was a special kind of a pet name that only the mother could use for the child. So among the Kalenjin people, there's these three great traditions around naming a baby. So that's the first thing I want to say then, kind of naming rituals in different places. I want to look then at the idea of initiation rites, and I just focused this point on Catholic baptism within the Catholic tradition. Now, I've done thousands and thousands of baptisms at this stage in 48 years as a priest. And what I've come to the conclusion is that it is very important that a baptism ceremony is not just a kind of a cutesy little ceremony, but it's actually a very serious commitment to the child. It's a commitment to raising the child in some kind of a spiritual culture where the child is surrounded by spirituality. That it's, in some senses, it's inducting the child into a spiritual community, into a community that's going to support the spiritual evolution of the child. And also the ceremony is about spiritual godparents, that in the absence of the parents, if anything should happen to the parents, that there are godparents who will step in and continue to honor this child's spiritual progress. And it's one of the questions whenever I do a baptism, I insist on meeting with the parents and the godparents at least twice before I'll agree to baptize a child. And one of the questions I'll always ask is, why have you chosen these particular people to be godparents? And very, very often, particularly in the West, it's like, oh, we're just honoring them, rather than these are people who are committed to the spiritual welfare of the child. So it becomes really, really important, why do you choose particular godparents for your child? Or what does baptism represent? So one of the questions that's asked in the baptism ceremony, in the Catholic ceremony, is, what name do you give to your child? So both the name of the child and the godparents you choose is really, really important. So occasionally I'll have the experience of, as I say, I always insist I will want to meet with the parents twice and the godparents twice, and I want to figure out whether or not these people are really committed to the spiritual evolution and of the child. And so occasionally, I'll meet with them because I always like to individualize a ceremony, whether it's a baptism ceremony or a marriage ceremony or a funeral. I want to make sure that the ceremony says exactly what the parents intended to say. So we'll pick special readings, special words, special music, special symbols to say, here's what we're trying to represent in this ceremony, that we really think it through. We're not just using an off-the-shelf ceremony, one size fits all. That a ceremony has to be tailor-made to the individual situation and the individual people involved in it. And so for me, I want to make sure that I'm individualizing the ceremony, whether it's a funeral service, a marriage service, or a baptism service. But in the case of a baptism, I want to make sure that the parents and the godparents are giving a guarantee of a lifetime commitment to this child's spiritual health. And occasionally, even after I've done that, and I brought the parents in and brought the godparents in and grilled them and created a ceremony, that's the last time I ever see them. I never see the child again, never see the parents again, and never see the godparents again. So there was a joke, actually, I'm sure many of you have heard of it, about three clergymen, a Protestant minister, a Jewish priest, a Catholic priest, and a Jewish rabbi who were really great friends, and they got together regularly. And at one stage, they reported every one of the houses of worship was experiencing a massive invasion and infestation of rodents, rats and mice coming in, and they're tearing their hair out to get rid of them. And the Protestant guy says, we set traps I would have a heart trust, we'd catch them and release them, and they'd be back again the next day. No matter what we did, the place was infested with rodents. And the Catholic guy said, well, we had to go one step further. We brought in a pest control and we fumigated the entire church. And within a month, they were all back again. And the Jewish rabbi says, well, we actually solved the problem. And they said, you did? And he said, yeah. How did you do it? Well, here's what we did. We called a big meeting. We invited all the rodents to attend the meeting. And we gave them great food. And we made little yarmulkes for each of them, little kippas for their heads. And then we circumcised all of them. And we never saw them again. So I don't know if it was the circumcision or the yarmulke. I don't know what did it, but they got rid of them. But it's often as they experience that, parents want their kids baptized. They want to give them a naming ceremony. They want to have a big party, which is great. But then you never see the kids again. And what I'm concerned about is, are they doing anything at all about the spiritual, responsibilities that have either the parents or the godparents? Because when you choose godparents, you're choosing them in loco parentis, in the place of parents, to make sure that the child's spiritual welfare is guaranteed into the future. There are some really horrific stories, I'm sure you've come across them, when the Jews of Europe were being rounded up for a Holocaust and they're being dragged away with their little babies, that there were Jewish mothers who literally tossed their babies out over fences to others and said, please save my baby. So they want not just to save the baby, they want to save their culture. They're trying to save their spiritual tradition as well. And that is what a baptism is for me. Baptism is not just about saving the child's soul, it's also about saving, a tradition, a spiritual tradition. And I'm not just talking about religion per se, I'm talking about deep spiritual commitment, mystical spirituality. That baptism is a symbol that the child is being guaranteed, being brought up in a spiritual, mystical tradition. But to use a kind of a metaphor, it's like you get the gift of a child and you are meant, you're in a preconception contract with this child. You've agreed before either of you incarnated that you will be a family, that you will help each other's spiritual evolution. So now you got this gift of a baby. So it's like you got this really expensive gift and it's wrapped up in paper and you tear off all the paper and the twine and then you throw away the gift and you treasure the twine and the paper. That's what it's like when you receive a child, a gift from God, and you throw away the child's spiritual welfare and you focus on, dressing it nicely or sending it to the best schools, or feeding it good food, all of which is important, but none of which is as important enough as the spiritual welfare of the child. So unfortunately, in our modern times, I see so many people getting the gift of the child, throwing the child away spiritually, and then focusing on the wrappings. So it becomes really, really important then that initiation rites are about the spiritual protection and development of the child and the tradition itself. So that would be my second point. My third point then, I'm going to call it name as mission. So what do we do when we have a new mission or we change, a particular phase of life? So I can report this as a small child. For the first 6 years of my life, I was raised by my grandparents. And at age 6, my parents came and took me back. And at this stage, I had 3 brothers and sisters whom I didn't know. They had lived in my parents' house. I know I'm being dragged back at age 6. And I know my name is John Francis, after my grandparents, my paternal grandparents. So I was really, really angry at my grandparents for giving me up. So I changed my name. I changed my name to Seán Proincius, which is the Gaelic form of John Francis. And thereafter, I was known in school and everything else as Seán Proincius. And it was like to kind of tell my grandparents, I can't believe you gave me up. You abandoned me and gave me back to these strangers whom I didn't know, although they were my birth parents. So, a change of name represents a change of self-identity. I was identifying now very, very differently. And part of it was done in anger. And it was interesting that for years and years and years and years afterwards, my aunts and uncles continued to call me John. Only very recently have some of them begun to call me Seán. So that was my own personal journey. When in my time in Kenya, living among the beautiful Kalenjin people, it was fascinating to me to watch another name change that happened. That when a woman got married very, very often, she'd be given a name that said something about her personality. And so a woman who was called, for instance, Tabelga, it literally means the one who sets the house on fire, Tabelga. she set the house on fire. But it's not that she was a pyromaniac. It was that she was such a warm personality that she brought this fire of love into the household that she was creating. Or I knew a woman whose name was Tabarngetun. Tabarngetun literally means the woman who killed the lion. But it wasn't that she went out into the bush with a spear looking for a Simba to kill. It was that, she tamed the man she got married to. That the guy she was married to was a real difficult character perhaps, and she managed to tame him. So Tabarngetun, she tamed the lion. When you look at nuns within the Catholic tradition, nuns, when young girls and young women, when they join a convent, very often they shave their heads, they change their clothes, and they change their names. So the names they're known by up to then changes completely. And this has to do with the sense of a changed sense of identity and a changed self of mission. I'm on a different phase of my life now. I've got a different purpose. I'm on a different mission. And to signify that, I'm going to change my name. But perhaps my favorite example of all is from a tribe of people living in West Africa. And among these people, traditionally, when a woman was about 8 months pregnant, the elders would sequester her into a hut, and they would put her into a hypnotic state, into a trance state. And then they would talk to the baby in the mother's womb. And they would believe that the baby would use the mother's voice in order to respond. And they would ask the child 2 questions. First question was, what is your name? What are you going to be called? And secondly, what is your mission? What are you coming here to do? And a month later, when the woman is giving birth, the women of the village would dance around her, and they're calling out the child's name to remind the child of its name and of its purpose. And so in this system, the naming ceremony, the name is given by the child itself. Now, I have a personal practice that whenever I meet a newborn with its parents, I'll ask the parents, what is the child's name? And why have you given it this particular name? What's the reason for it? And then I'll take the child in my arms and I'll ask the child face to face, what have you come here to do? What is your purpose? And I really, really mean it. I'm not trying to be cutesy. Every child has come here on a mission. Every child is a prophet. They're the latest revelation of God in our midst. And we need to treasure them, and we need to figure out and accommodate to the mission they're on and the purpose for which they incarnated. I believe actually at this stage of world history that there are some very brave, compassionate souls entering incarnation at our time. And I am deeply grateful for their courage.